Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. And now for the guy that didn't go to broadcasting school in the event you couldn't tell.
Oh, don't you know, it's the Bill Arnold Show. It's Bill.
And a warm welcome to the Bill Arnold Show. So glad you could join me today. I am very happy to let you know that J. Warner Wallace is my first guest today. And I look forward every month to having him on. And I think the amount of show prep that we do between the two of us is, what would you say, Wyatt, 0.8 seconds?
Well, you did a little more than that here before we hopped on, so more than usual. But yeah, it's not very much usually.
Just because I want to let Jim know that he's free to go wherever he wants, because if you head over to coldcasechristianity.com and look at the books, the writings, the videos, the podcasts, and all the resources that are available there, you will quickly discover he can talk about anything. Jim, so glad to have you back.
Well, you know, isn't it clever how you shifted that and you made it sound like you're doing this on purpose because you want to provide me some service. when in reality, I know better than that.
I could be a phony once in a while, can't I?
Well, in your opening, it talks about how, did you go to broadcasting? Do they have a school?
I think they do, yeah.
I thought you just learned by doing it.
No, there's a broadcasting school. I think you learn to talk like this.
Yeah, is that how that works?
I don't know.
Well, I didn't go to the interviewee school either, but there's always something, it seems like, going on in culture that is worth us, kind of looking at it from a Christian worldview perspective. That's something we haven't really talked about much too, Bill, is that so much of what we experience that we would say is traumatic is directly connected to what our expectations were based on our worldview. In other words, if you look at how even like the sociologists will define trauma, they almost always define it as, a kind of a crushing. You expected something in the world, this kind of thing shouldn't happen to me, and then it happens to you, and then your expectations are dashed, and it can be something that you and I might think, well, this is a relatively minor thing for you to be so traumatized about it, but the reality of it is that we don't hold that expectation that person held. And then so this is why I think Jesus spends so much time, especially in the latter part of John's gospel, where he's basically just doing discipleship with the apostles. He's spending time with them saying, hey, you got to expect some stuff.
Yeah.
You're going to have tribulation, and it's okay. I mean, I've overcome. I'm going to show you how to overcome, but you got to expect that. I think what he's trying to do is to help us to have an appropriate worldview that incorporates trauma, so that when we incorporate suffering, I should say, and then when we experience the suffering, it doesn't shatter our worldview. It's like we kind of saw it coming,
Mm-hmm. Jim, how did you manage expectations when you worked on cold cases that went on and on and on with maybe little movement?
Well, I mean, that's the great thing about so, if I get a fresh homicide, there is an expectation. There's an expectation that you won't let it go cold.
Right.
And so that's a lot more pressure, it seems to me. I loved picking up somebody else's mess and saying, okay, what can I do with it? Because really, honestly, most people had kind of let go of it and kind of had no expectations for the case. And the family, of course, does. But let's say it's a guy who worked the case. I had a case from 1979. By the time I picked it up, it was like 2006, maybe. So by the time we get to 2006, there's every 2 generations of detectives who could have felt responsible for this case have already gone. So there's no expectation or I've got fresh cases, so I didn't have to carry that expectation. And that's one of the good things about cold cases, is that you feel like if I can do anything with this, I mean, if I didn't do anything, it's still going to be cold. So if I can move it in any direction toward closure, or toward justice at least, then I've done something. So I think you're right, though, that it's all about, we know this, expectations are what determine outcomes and your satisfaction at the end. If you go to a restaurant and you only picked it because it was 5-star on Yelp, and then you get there and it's 4.5 stars. It's not bad. It's good. But you're like, hey, this is supposed to be 5-star, and suddenly you're disappointed with a 4.5-star restaurant. Well, that's because your expectations were high. So for me, I really enjoyed that season of my career where it was, my grandfather was this way. His name is Warner, and that's why I use his name, J. Warner Wallace. And my grandfather was like a builder and a carpenter. And what he loved was making something out of nothing. You got this little broken chair. Let's turn it into this. And then we take this thing that's got no value and we turn it into something valuable. And so that idea of kind of creating something that didn't exist before out of something that's broken, that's kind of what you're doing in cold cases. You're picking up something that feels like it's going to stay closed. It's not closed, but it's going to stay inactive. But you can maybe make something beautiful out of this.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts were about the attempt on the president's life at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. What did you think about that guy just bursting in through the security?
Well, he came from Torrance. So that's the agency I worked for.
I remember
years.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they went back and did a search warrant. My son was on a weekend. So my son was off that weekend. So he didn't have to lock anything down or be part of that search warrant. But I remember thinking, and I wrote an article about this at the Thin Blue Life, where we just talk about how, we typically, your town kind of gets that name that, he came from Torrance. Like, Torrance is like any other town. It's filled with regular people who on the surface look like regular people. And you might know something about his so if you knew all of his thought life and you had been privy to all the conversations he probably had, you might know something about you might not be surprised that this guy did this. But I'll bet you there's a ton of people who thought they knew him pretty well, who were like shocked by the fact that he would do such a thing. And that just illustrates for you and I the accuracy of the Christian worldview that says, yeah, it turns out we're all that guy. We're all that guy who is capable of something we think, no way. But everyone is this enigma, where you have you're two things at once. You're capable of something beautiful and capable of something horrific, all in the same moment, because that's just the nature of the human condition that is described perfectly in Scripture, that no one is truly good. And so we shouldn't be shocked when you find someone in your neighborhood who you go, well, no way. But we're not even now we're on the map for this guy. Well, yeah, because this is the nature of humans. Now, him getting through that security, there's lots to be said about elevated security, especially when you've had so many prior attempts. So I would think that this would be the president that you would, and probably every president from this point on, because we're in this world that is so divided and so polarized that probably these are the kinds of events that have to be unbelievably micromanaged from a security perspective, right? And it's a target. All you have to do is make the target really hard. And that's going to be perimeter stuff. When Charlie Kirk got shot, that's a really difficult setting to secure, because there's no, you're far better off if you're going to go to that campus to do it in a closed room where the only way in are through doors you can man, and then you can screen everyone who comes in. Really hard to hurt someone in that kind of a setting. Do it out in public like that. This is a much riskier proposition. So it's a bummer that when you got an indoor event that does have hard entry points, that something can still be penetrable, this could still happen. But at the same time, you could argue, well, how did he get in the hotel? But the security point did actually do its job, because it prevented the guy who was armed from getting through that point. So there's kind of two ways of looking at that, right? But here's what I would say, that from a Christian worldview perspective. So we know that there's a continuum of action that starts in your thought life. And then you think these things and you allow yourself to have an unchecked, uncontrolled thought life, because you don't have a worldview in place, like a Christian worldview, that would help you to say, hey, I ought not be thinking that way. And this is what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. That turns out your thoughts matter. They matter, and because your thoughts are really the next step. But the next step is typically you start voicing your thoughts. And then after a season of voicing your thoughts, you start acting on the things you have voiced. So it all starts with the thought life that goes unchecked, and then it starts. And what we are in our culture right now is we have taken the lid off of the first two steps in that three-step action. We of course, the worldview, if your Christian worldview starts to weaken in any culture or any worldview that would limit the way you think you ought to be thinking, well, then that lid is off. And now we're in a social media environment where everyone can say whatever they want for the most part, and it's just more and more vile. And now then we're shocked when somebody actually acts after you've let them. We're shocked when they take the third step when you did nothing to stop the first two. Not that we should be like suppressing speech. I'm a big free speech advocate, but what I would say is that we are in a culture where we not only respect harsh talk toward each other, but we now elect candidates that are using the F word in their speeches, and they're constant. Like we don't have any penalty even in the way we would say, okay, well, he's no longer a candidate for me or she's no longer a candidate for me because she speaks a certain way. No, actually, we don't. That's no longer a guiding principle for us. And so now we've got people who are screaming all the time, and then you're surprised when someone decides to try to shoot somebody. Well, it's because we've developed a culture in which we have no regulation over it. And not that we should want to regulate free speech. Again, it's not that. It's that we are content with a vile view of the world. We're kind of okay with that. And our Christian worldview says, no, your thought life matters. And you don't get any credit for loving the people who love you.
Right.
That's you don't get credit for loving the people that you ordinarily would hate if you didn't have a worldview in place that would help you see that it turns out you are just as in need of forgiveness as anybody else in the room. And so you can't. And we talked about this before. The least forgiving people are the people for whom they think they have nothing to be forgiven. If you don't need forgiveness, why you wouldn't offer it to anybody else? When you realize how much you need forgiveness, then you're more likely to offer it to others. This is the parable that Jesus told Simon in his house when the woman from the city came in, and Simon didn't do so much as even wash his feet, and this woman is adoring him, and Simon is thinking that he has no idea who she is. But of course he does know who she is, and he just tells Simon, yeah, it's because she knows how much she needs to be forgiven for that she can love well. But you don't know how much you think you don't have anything to be forgiven for. So you don't love nearly as well. I think we're in a culture right now where that is definitely the case. Now, how do we back up over it without putting laws in place that limit free speech? I think it has to precede speech. It's about a worldview because it starts in your thought life. And if we're going to allow the Christian worldview to completely crumble, then it's only going to get worse.
So good. All right, Jim, I'm going to take my first break. Come back. I also want to invite anyone listening, if they have a topic, something maybe they've heard about in the news that they would like us to discuss with J. Warner Wallace, let me know what it is. I do have a topic in mind when we come back, Jim, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. If you have a topic, you can text it over. The text line is 877-933-2484. Be right back. It is my deepest desire that you take the very first step of faith by placing your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. If you've got questions about what it means to begin a relationship with Jesus, text the word faith to 41224. I'm back with J. Warner Wallace. Go learn more about him at coldcasechristianity.com. You will love his website. So much good content there. Matter of fact, I was looking at the most dangerous kind of faith in the church today. I listened to that podcast today. That was awesome.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. I think it was something that I'm always surprised when you talk to Christians and you'll talk about the evidential case that could be made for what they believe so that you can root your Christian worldview in more than just an opinion. If you actually knew it was evidentially true, I think it would change the way you leverage it in trauma or in suffering. But you'll talk to people and even when you describe the evidential nature of Jesus, they'll always say, I never thought of it that way. And that's what we're trying to do with that podcast, is just help people to see that, yeah, you could actually have a reasoned view of Christianity that will help you on the days when it doesn't feel right, when it doesn't feel powerful. Because there are going to be days when you're going to go, why is God allowing this to happen to me? And those are the days you need to know, well, look, I don't necessarily understand it, but I got more than enough evidence to demonstrate that it's true. So here we go.
Yeah. I saw how you talked about churches will avoid apologetics, and, this just have faith can be intellectual laziness. And that's why I think kids, when they leave for college, they find that they're persuadable by counterfeit worldviews.
Well, think about this for a second. If I said to you, and this is when I ask this question around the country, it always comes back the same way. If I said to you, okay, what convinced you that Christianity is true? I often will get as one of the answers, well, I had an experience that demonstrated, like, something that there's just no way you could argue. It's like it seemed too, the odds were too far against it. It seemed like this was God speaking to me. It's experiential. Now, that's great. And I do think that often we have experiences that demonstrate something is true. But if you put your trust on the basis of an experience, do you think at some point in your 50 years as a let's say I got saved in my 30s, so I hope to have 50 years as a Christian. Do you think at some point in those 50 years I'm going to have an experience that is going to be troubling from my Christian perspective? Yeah, I think we all are. I mean, okay, so you get cancer, someone you love is senselessly killed. Something's going to happen that you're going to go, well, oh, wow, I only based this on an experience, and now my experience of life in general is not good. So maybe so if we're going to base it on experience, well, then be prepared to lose it on experience, or to struggle with it on the basis of an experience in the other direction. Now, wouldn't it be nice to know that you had an experience and you can now understand where that experience came from, because you have tested it and you understand the evidence upon which that is built. And you also have, as part of your worldview, it's deep enough as a Christian that you have an explanation for evil. So that it's never like, well, I don't understand the whole evil thing, but I'm just going to hold it. No, actually, I think you can make a strong case for why God might allow something bad to happen to us. And if that's part of your worldview, then when something bad happens to you, it fits within your expectations. And There we go again. It's based on expectations.
Yeah, I love the way you're putting this. This is really good. So you also talked about a passage out of Hebrews 11, the story of doubting Thomas. I thought that was good.
Yeah. So you're talking about the one in the Gospel of John, right? When Thomas comes and what I think is fascinating about that is that Thomas tells his buddies, I don't know, this doesn't sound right to me, and I got to see it. I got to be able to. And
Right.
he kind of makes a list of I need to be able to see this and put my hand in his wound and put my hand in his side. Like, he gives like 3 things he needs to have evidentially in order to believe. And how many times have you heard someone? Because the very end of the story, Jesus is going to say to him, blessed are you that believe, but more blessed are those who don't get to see and yet believe. And people will use that line from Jesus as a way of arguing. Well, there you go. Jesus is saying you're blessed if you believe without seeing. But that is not the view that Jesus holds in that passage. And I can tell you why it's not. Number one, Jesus comes, and if he held that view, that no, you shouldn't have to ask for the evidence. You're more blessed if you believe without it, then he would not have given the evidence to Thomas. But what he does is right away, he appears to Thomas and he lists in order the 3 things that Thomas has been asking for. He says, go ahead and do these 3 things, because he knows what Thomas said about what he needed. And he provides those 3 data points of evidence. And then he says, yeah, you believe because do this so you will believe, Thomas. And Thomas right away believes on the basis of what's being offered to him. And then Jesus said, blessed are those who don't see but believe. And then right away, it talks about how why is John writing this? John talks about, this is John chapter 20, verse 31, I think, where he says, I'm writing about these signs, including this one with Thomas, so that you will believe. And he picks all the other miracles that he writes about for that purpose. So John is telling me, I'm giving you this evidence, signs, so that you will believe. And then what is Jesus saying to Thomas? He's saying, Thomas, you believe because you saw it. Now, blessed are those who didn't see it themselves, but will come to faith because of you, Thomas, because your eyewitness testimony is going to help them believe. And eyewitness testimony is direct evidence. So there's no way to cut this without, and to actually effectively cut the evidential nature of Jesus out of that. He is very much, I think I'm in chapter 10 with my, or maybe 11 with my kids. It's the end of 10, I think, where Jesus offers, he says to the crowd, look, if you don't believe me, believe on the evidence of these miraculous signs I've performed in front of you. So there's another piece of indirect evidence, the signs again. So Jesus does use signs, does use evidence. He's a consummate evidentialist. And this view that somehow we have a weaker faith if it has to be grounded in something evidential. It doesn't resonate with what Jesus did, because Jesus consistently used evidence to make his case. He used direct evidence. He would say the testimony of John the Baptist. Well, that's direct evidence. And he would say the miraculous healings and signs I've done. There's the indirect evidence. He's using the only two forms of evidence we use in criminal trials. He's using both of them to make his case.
So interesting, Jim. All right, here's a question on the text line. Moves into police work. What are your thoughts on facial recognition as the only method to find someone guilty for a crime, referencing the case with the lady that was jailed for months as the Fargo police identified her face and it wasn't her?
Well, okay, so what we would say, and this is how I've always worked cases, is that I work cumulative cases. So what that means is if we had somebody back in the day who could have identified the suspect in the case, it would have got closed 30 years ago. But it's open because it's lame to begin with. So we have to build the case on death by 1,000 paper cuts. So here's how I would use facial recognition, and every agency is different. There's smaller agencies in California that have so few homicides that when they have a homicide, they have to bring in the county sheriff, just like it may be in some small different parishes or whatever in Louisiana might bring in a state trooper, or because they don't get enough homicides to get the kind of experience you need. So you bring in an agency who hopefully has got more experience. And so I can't speak for how every agency in the country is approaching this. But what I do with that piece of evidence is, okay, once you know who it is, or you think you know who it is by facial recognition, now it's your duty to build the robust cumulative case that confirms that. Because even if an eyewitness came to me and said, it's her, identified him in a lineup. Okay, that's just one piece now. Now is he lying? For all I know, he's got something against this guy. And so he's lying about his identification of this person. So now I've got a pointer at least. I'm now focused on this suspect. And I've got to now make the case with everything else. And we've had cases like that. I think I've told you about this case of this 10-year-old girl back in 1972 in our city. And we had a guy who we thought was the guy. And he even confessed to it. The confession's a lie.
Oh, boy.
And it took us, years to get him out of the case. So, and it stayed open until 2019, from 1972 to 2019. So the reality of it is that you build the case cumulatively. I would never, if all I had was one witness, a living witness who said, he's the guy, and I had nothing else to corroborate that, dude's not going to jail yet. Okay. He's not going to be in custody. So the question there is, I don't know that case in its detail. Like, was it just on the facial recognition? If that's the case, well, that's where the error was made. Mm-hmm. Because to me, you're going to build these things cumulatively on a number of different data points. All that facial recognition does for me is give me a starting point. Okay, this is somebody worth looking at. Same thing, for example, if I had a plate reader and the plate tells me, okay, here's the car. So now I've got a suspect car, but do I really know that he was in that car? Somebody else driving it that day? It just gives me a point at which to begin. Mm-hmm. But now I've got to build the robust case on top of that.
So, Jim, what kind of psychological profile is there on a guy that would admit to a crime with a 10-year-old that didn't do it?
Well, this guy definitely had his own set of issues. And after I listened to it's about 1,000 pages in the transcript. And that was the first thing I did on that case is I opened the transcript because I knew we had a guy in custody back in the day. And when I opened it, it was still unsolved. So I thought, well, maybe they let this guy go when he really is the suspect. I mean, he confessed to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back and read the transcript, listened to the tapes. And unfortunately, if you listen to the it was not intentional, but what would happen there? Well, number one, what's his profile? His profile was, I can tell you this, he never received this much attention from anyone in his entire life as he received from these two detectives who interviewed him for, days.
Interesting.
And days. Yeah, and it was clear he was trying to impress them. And he
thought
would
of
take
that.
little things they would say, just little things they would say, and he would run with it. And then that would provoke some other little thing they shouldn't say. And then he would build this thing. And so it felt like, wow, he seems to know these details, not even remembering that 2 interviews ago you slipped that out.
Wow.
And now he's got a memory that's great. He builds on these pieces, and it never quite made sense. Like he had some things correct. Well, yeah, what he had heard, but he had a lot of things that didn't match the physical evidence we knew we had. So it was troublesome, right? Mm-hmm. And this is not the first time that kind of thing has happened. That happens a lot.
Wow.
Where you get somebody who wants, for whatever reason, to be the focus, and then doesn't. But you've got a detective maybe who has not done a lot of these. Mm-hmm. A lot of these kinds of murders. What drives someone to kill a child? What are we looking for? What's the profile of that kind of a person? There's a lot that goes into this, and I know even for me, I've only done so many murders, and there's going to be a lot of categories of murder that I'm not going to be as good at because I've never worked one of those, whatever the those is. So you have to be. I always say you have to have some evidential modesty, right, about what you think you might know or what you think you might be able to know based on your skill set.
Mm-hmm. Jim, another question popped up. I'm wondering what you think about our fascination with crime stories. I've watched Columbo, Murder, She Wrote, and if I allowed myself, I would watch shows about cold cases and things like that. But I don't know if it's a wise thing to be doing. So as believers, what do you think?
I think that if you look at Scripture, Old Testament Scripture, it kind of feels like one crime episode after another in some of these Old Testament books, right? So, for example, I'm in 1 Samuel with a buddy to kind of doing a joint Bible study through it, and I'm at that point where Saul has now kind of messed things up, and Samuel tells him that you're done. God has moved on from you, and he's already selected the next king. Now, we're still probably 3 or 4 chapters away from David, okay? So there's going to be a lot of twists and turns in this story. We're well ahead of Goliath. So we're like still pretty early in the Saul saga. Yet you already know where it's going. So what is the whole point of describing every sordid twist and turn of stupid that we're going to see before we get to David? Let's just jump to David. Well, it's clear that Scripture is not just recording history. Number one, this is the history that actually occurred, so that's why it's in there. But 2, there's something that God intends for us to learn, even though we kind of know where it's headed. And I think there's something about crime, true crime, that is at least that's one aspect of it, I think. Yes, everyone loves to arrogantly think they can solve the riddle, and every true crime story is depicted on TV. Even though they could write it 1,000 different ways, it is written to kind of squeak out one detail after another so that you, the viewer, starts to assemble this case and you think you know where it's going, and then they pull the rug out from under you. It's going in this different direction because they know that it's in our innate nature to want to arrogantly think we can solve it before the detective does. Oh, I could have seen that coming. Mm-hmm. Oh, I knew from the very beginning it was so-and-so. So there's that part of it. But I think a lot of it is that it's a cautionary tale for a lot of people, because you could think to yourself, oh, that could have been me. I've got a relationship that's similar to that. Oh, I know someone who's like that. Oh, I've been in an office that late at night. Like, in other words, we kind of look at it. I think there are life lessons in every one of these stories.
Yeah, I agree. All right, we're going to take a little break and be right back with J. Warner Wallace. If you have a question or comment, it is welcome. The text line is open, 877-933-2484.
Bill needs a minute, he needs a minute, Bill needs a minute, he'll be right back. Bill needs a minute, he just needs a minute, Bill needs a minute, he'll be right back. Bill took a minute, and now he's back.
Yeah, I am back with J. Warner Wallace, and Jim, Wyatt and I were talking over the break about something that we had discussed earlier in the day. You and me brought up the whole idea of what's going on in Christianity with the monetization of it.
Yeah,
I've got a can of worms. I just opened it.
No, and I've thought, I brought it up originally. I think about it a lot because I think that so much of what we're doing now in the public kind of discussion of Christianity is now being driven by a technology that wasn't even available for us, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be if you wanted to talk about Christianity as a public figure, you would have to have a radio show like you have, Bill.
Yeah, I know.
And there were gatekeepers for that. There's only going to be so many people that can get to that point where they can make it and be successful doing this kind of radio show. Well, now everyone. I mean, you've seen the numbers on these podcasts and YouTube channels where you and my fear of it is that we often now I see. Look, we always talk about what is behind any misbehavior, right? It's always the pursuit of sex, money, and power. Mm-hmm. And here, there's two aspects of this, right? The first is that everything is monetized. So, and that can look, if you knew that there's an issue that needs to be discussed, and it ought to be discussed in the culture, but it's not popular, and it seems like it's kind of nichey, and if you discuss it, your audience will stay pretty small. But maybe we want to talk about, for example, the moral underpinning we just talked about a minute ago from the Sermon on the Mount, or why. But that topic is, for a lot of people, if you want clicks, you're going to talk about the latest conspiracy theory involving this celebrity in the Christian world, right? This investigation of this guy or this gal, or how much now are we focused on what's happening to Erica Kirk or the Charlie Kirk saga, mm-hmm. right? All of it. And so now you've got people who are making decisions about what it is they will even talk about based on the pursuit of clicks. And that's about power, because any celebrity is grounded in the power thing. Power, authority, respect, celebrity, it's all in the same bucket. Or those clicks can be monetized now with either sponsors or just the YouTube advertising, whatever it may be. And look, and we have a YouTube page, and I've had it for coming up on, I think, 19 years. I've had it. So we just kind of trickled along, just making. I'm not a YouTuber, but I do have videos on that YouTube page, and I just talk about the things that I'm geeked out about that week. Mm-hmm. Like if I'm in John and I'm geeked out about this, I'll do a podcast on it. Now, I recognize that that's only going to appeal to a small number of people. But if I stop and I think, well, boy, I'd like to grow this channel, it will start to change not only the things I talk about, but the way I have to talk about them in order to compete with the kind of level of vitriol that is clickable right now. And I think what's happening is we're allowing a platform, we're allowing a monetary system here on YouTube and other channels like it that is now determining really not only the kinds of things we talk about and the way we talk about them, but even the things that we will allow ourselves to be interested in. Because if in one way, I've said this controversially, I'll just say it again. When I teach a class at Biola on this, we're getting ready to teach it again in September. Like, what do you do with your master's degree in Christian apologetics? I think if you asked me 10 years ago, it would be a different answer. If you asked me today, I would say, go get a job that's not in Christian apologetics and pay your bills. So that when you talk about the Christian worldview, it has no connection to your popularity, the number of clicks you get, or how much income you're going to get off that channel. Because those are the things that ultimately will be the tail that wags the dog and decides what the things we're talking about. There are some topics, I had a young man from Biola who was running my YouTube channel for a while, and I noticed that he would find one question that I answered in a Q&A at a conference 10 years ago, but it happens to be on a controversial topic. He would cut that video 5 different ways and put it out there because it would get a lot of clicks. And for me, it's not who I mean, okay, did I answer that question on public? Yeah. Is it is it what I think the thrust of this is Great Commission work to me. And this is why I did not start any of this until I had a pension. And if you're going to do this, I don't want that to be the reason why I decided to talk about something, because this is going to get a big audience. But I mean, let's be honest, we're seeing that right now. we're every controversial, and people often, when you connect, and I'm somebody I believe that if you are voting from you vote from your worldview. Everyone does. You cannot help but vote from your worldview. So do I think that your Christian worldview ought to guide the way you process claims in culture and candidates you're going to vote for? Of course it should, because everyone's worldview does that. But when we start to confuse those two things, because I guarantee you that of the kinds of platforms that grow fastest, the ones that address the cultural issues from a political perspective, those are going to grow faster. So if you're out there just trying to think, well, what should I talk about to build a big audience? Well, I can kind of tell you what that would be, but it may not be in the best interest of our worldview to be putting ourselves in this position where we're all just trying to compete for those clicks.
Mm-hmm. Jim, what do you think about some of these guys on YouTube and some of the women on YouTube that they have compelling personalities, they've got a persuasive style, and at the end of their little video, I'll sit and think to myself, well, that wasn't biblical, but they've got millions of clicks.
Well, that's been going on forever, right? I mean, this is in Scripture, right? And Paul is talking about it. You know, you as a leader in the church, you're going to have to do something about people who are going to come in the church and are going to hold a sideways worldview that's not Christianity, and you're going to have to be discerning and protect the flock from false teachers. And so that's always been part of it, because we're driven by those three things: sex, money, and power. And here it's about power. I'm right, you're wrong. This is the view. And if that view can also be monetized, well, now I've got two of the three. And then you see these folks, sometimes these national figures, who slip into some form of sexual encounter with somebody. And now you've got all three of these. And you and I have talked about this too. I've learned that of those three motives behind misbehavior, if you entertain just one of them, you will eventually entertain all three, because the one will open the door to the other two.
So true.
And that's why, although it seems like, and we've said this before, you protect your pastor from the pursuit of money, you protect your pastor from the pursuit of sex by putting these guardrails up on his pastorate. But when it comes to fame, no, you want your pastor to be famous, and that's the mistake you're making. You're opening the door by allowing the unmitigated pursuit of power, fame, celebrity, influence. You're opening the door to the other two. So then the question becomes, how is whatever it is that God has given you, is it ministry enough? You know, we have our families, and we know we're called as Christian husbands to minister to our families first. Is that ministry enough? And I knew when I first came out of law enforcement that if I didn't wait and have the pension that would at least pay my bills, that I would eventually find myself having to make a living talking about Jesus. And is there a place in Scripture for that? Yeah, of course. I mean, Paul talks about it, that there's going to be some people who deserve to be paid as ministers. But I just knew, because those are the things that eventually open the door to other things, I didn't want to make my decisions based on that. So if you ask me today, like, how would I establish it? I would say, okay, I'm going to talk about Jesus a lot. And because I feel like this is the Great Commission calling on all of our lives as Christians. So I'm a public communicator about the things of Jesus. But I would do that even if, I sell books. That's the only thing that is monetized. It's the books. Is that if you want to deeper dive into any of these ideas, but man, we try to provide, 100 pieces of free content on any topic before we write a book about it. Because I always tell people, hey, if you can't, you should exhaust everything the author is willing to give you for free before you have to buy a book. And that, I think, for me at least, it tries to balance that goal. What's driving you? For example, if I always wonder, think of all the most popular communicators. If you're in the audience right now, think of the most popular communicators that you're watching on YouTube or podcasts or whatever it may be. Okay, great. You have a list in your mind of 4 or 5 people that are the most popular in the nation. Now ask yourself a question. If there wasn't a dime in it, and there was no way to even know how many people were listening to your podcast, because those statistics are not kept. So you could work your tail off, and you'd never know. You would get no money out of it, and you'd never know if you got 1 listener or 100,000. You wouldn't know. I want to ask yourself an honest question. How long do you think these people would continue to do this? I think they would stop.
Yeah.
I think this is driven entirely by the pursuit of money and fame. And then when it gets to that point, now I'm not talking about people who are preaching the gospel and that's what they want to do. I'm talking about people who are commenting on the culture we're living in, allegedly or not, from a Christian perspective. And that's where I think we have to kind of at least be honest. We have to self-check that and figure out, like, and this is, if you're doing a thumbnail for your YouTube video, like we've in the last 3 years, we've said, hey, we don't want any picture of our face on the thumbnail. Well, that tanks your viewership, because people want to know, is that so and so? Is that so and so's video? But if you're saying, well, I don't want to elevate so and so, I want to elevate the idea that so and so is talking about. I want to get our face off of it. Mm-hmm. But if you do that, you're going to reduce and you have to be really comfortable with, it's going to be smaller, but that's okay, because we're trying to resist these three things that ultimately lead to trouble.
But what about when bigger is always better? And so then you're caught in that position.
Well, so there's a question. That's a great question for church leaders. So everyone who does this wants to know, am I doing a good job? I get that. We all want to know, are we doing a good job? If you're a church pastor, you want to know, how would you know that? Well, you want to at least look at some kind of a metric. Mm-hmm. Like, how do I measure a good job? And if you're a church leader, we have traditionally measured that by church attendance, baptisms, and money raised, donations. And so then you're thinking, well, if I've got more of any of those three, then I'm doing better than I was last year when I had less of one of those three. So now we're measuring that way. Now, if what you're trying to get is a more mature, we talked about this, I think, last time, the difference between a people who and a place where. If you're trying to grow a people who kind of congregation, how would you measure that? Like, how do you measure the level of commitment and how much this discipleship group you're leading has put their identity in Christ, and how committed they are to the? That's much harder to measure. And so then the question, and ultimately, when you measure that, you're probably going to go to some numerical metric. So if you said, well, we do missions trips, well, how many of you do them, and how many do you do a year? See what we're doing? We're falling back into a numerical metric. Mm-hmm. So I get it. It's hard. It's really hard to know if you're doing well. So I guess the question is, what if there was no way to know? Would you still serve? Even if you're a church pastor and they don't give me the stats, I don't know, I can't, and I'm blind, so I can't see if our congregation's bigger. Well, that would at least tell me that you're in it for the right reason, right? Mm-hmm. Because none of those other three temptations are driving you, because you've taken your eyes off those three. Yeah. And I think what we have to do in the real world is, as leaders, take our eyes off those three.
I love it. Let me take a little break. J. Warner Wallace is my guest. Head over to coldcasechristianity.com. Learn more about him and his work. We'll be right back. Welcome is a word said universally all over the world. Every language on the planet has their own way of making a friendly greeting. At Faith Radio, when we welcome, we really mean it. Learn more about us by requesting a free welcome pack gift. Text the word welcome to 877-933-2484 or visit myfaithradio.com to request your welcome pack today. And a warm welcome to you. I'm back with J. Warner Wallace. During the break, Wyatt and I, Jim, we're talking about this whole idea of trying to be well known so you can get more eyes and ears on you. And I remember hearing Tim Keller say that, if anybody comes to his church, he wants them to come because a friend invited them to go.
Yeah. No,
not that there's a celebrity pastor preaching, but that a friend invited them.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think that's a couple of things. So what we talked about this before too, that influence is driven by those two things that come together: information and relationship. Information and relationship. If you want to influence your kids, it's because you either have a great relationship with them, but you also need the information. So when they have a question, you can answer it. And if you get them a book from me, I might have some information, but I have no relationship with your kids. So I'm going to be less influential. And that's why when you say, hey, you want to have a friend invite you to church, it's because that relationship side And what celebrities often do is they try to convince you that you know them, that you're in relationship with them. And that's not hard if you're listening to a podcast 5 days a week. You feel like you know the person whose voice you listen to for 5 hours a week. But that's the illusion, right? The illusion is that somehow you know this. And in fact, what you really know, and this is even true for people like me, who I've been podcasting for almost 20 years. And people will say to me all the time, listen to your podcast every week, and I feel like I know you. Well, you just know the person I've allowed you to see. Because the only, I mean, even your spouse doesn't know everything you're thinking, but she definitely has the best insight into who I really am. And so again, what we're trying to do with celebrities sometimes is convince an audience that they know us so that they will continue to come back to us and trust us over all others. So as I'm watching all of this and I'm watching that we're starting to have conversations online, I see a lot of them on YouTube. I'll give you an example of this. Just Jeremy Boring, who's a Christian, who used to be the leader of the Daily Wire. He now has his own show, and he's starting to process some of this out loud. And I thought, oh, good for him. He's starting to talk about the kinds of things that are going to eventually corrupt the conversation we're having publicly about Christianity, because we're going to start making decisions that are not based on, well, what does Scripture say? What is Scripture calling me to say or think in this moment? We're instead kind of looking at it and saying, well, look, now this is my income. This is true also for him. This is true for anyone who is saying, hey, I'm going to step out and make this everything I am. So my identity is in it. It's also I'm going to make this everything that pays the bills. Well, now you've got several things that are not just shaping the way you think and talk, in the way you decide what to talk about and how you say it, but it also starts like you almost can't allow yourself to think something that would hurt that. So it starts to change the way you think about issues, because you're always thinking about it from the perspective of, well, would this help or hinder me in this objective of growing an audience?
So good. So, what's the next project you've got going?
Well, so what I'm trying to do now is I've been thinking about, I stay in my lane really for the most part. You and I, when we talk, we jump a lot out of that lane. But when I'm writing books, I know that I'm a detective, and so what people expect from me is a certain kind of book. Mm-hmm. And I love writing books because it allows me to master something I didn't previously necessarily master as well. Like I'd love to do a book on murder in the Bible or something like this that really leverages a specific murder in the Bible that taught me something. This is why I wrote The Truth in True Crime, because there are so many examples in murder cases that teach you something. So I think I'll probably do something in that lane. I'm not sure exactly what yet, but I'm in a great season. Again, I'm not making a living as an author, right? So I can write anything I want as long as a publishing house is willing to say, okay, we'll risk it. And what I've been typically telling publishing houses is I don't want in advance. If this thing flops, I don't want you to have any money in it, because that's not why I'm writing it. I'm writing it because I'm interested in this weird thing, and I think God's got me interested in it for a reason. So let me write about it. But again, you have to take those three things out. If nobody wanted to publish it, I'd just self-publish it. I mean, it's because I feel like, I'm thinking about this. I'm reading about it in Scripture. I'd like to write something about it. It'll force me to study it even deeper. So that's the kind of thing that is animating me now. But also, Bill, I'm older now. When you first met me, I was just starting at, in my early 50s. And I didn't write a first book until I was 52. Mm-hmm. So now I'm 60, almost 65. So it's okay. Now there's a season, and this is another way. You and I talk about this all the time. If you're in your 60s and you're still working like you're in your 50s, you probably missed something at some point, right? Like you had an opportunity and I try to be very careful about staging this so that I could spend time with my grandchildren at this age. So that's a lot of what I'm doing now, which is why, for example, we are having this interview on Monday, because on Wednesday, it's been about impossible to keep me on the phone in my bedroom hiding from my grandchildren.
And they're usually napping, so that gives you the opportunity, but we can't always count on them napping.
Well, and the Wi-Fi is not good there either. So that's why I said, hey, tell you what, we got to do this on Monday, so I have a little bit of space to be able to talk to you guys.
Jim, thanks for taking the time once again. I so value you as a guest on the show and as a friend. Thank you so much for doing it.
Appreciate you, Bill.
You bet. J. Warner Wallace has been my guest. Head over to coldcasechristianity.com and you can learn more about Jim. We're going to take a break, and then hour 2, Dave Pollack is going to join us. He's written a book called Every Day Counts. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. That's all next. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.
There are moments in life when you don't know what comes next.
In one moment, everything changed.
Moments of loss.
My world, just everything starts falling apart.
Moments of fear.
I tried to slow down and I couldn't. I'm putting both feet on the brake pedal and nothing's happening.
Moments of doubt.
If you're real.
And in those moments, people discover something unexpected.
That's the moment that the color came back in the room. It was literally like a light switch went on.
On the Wild God Stories podcast, you'll hear true stories of real people.
We start spinning out of control and we start calling out on the Lord.
I owe him my very life.
And when we say Wow God, we're talking about the one true living God.
I just sensed God say, help this woman. And I just told her about Jesus.
Wow God Stories, wherever you get your podcasts.